We've all seen the victory feasts in the overflowing drinking horns, the raucous celebrations, the heaps of gold on display. But another tale begins once the bonfires burn out, a tale seldom spoken aloud. It's the account of noble-born women, the queens, the princesses, the daughters of chieftains, whose strongholds have just fallen to an enemy. What befell them wasn't a mere afterthought, it was a calculated tactic. This isn't a narrative of romance or daring rescues. It's about what truly occurred when the shouting ended and the hidden cost of defeat came due. Here, we'll examine 7 such destinies. If you appreciate well-documented history like this, consider subscribing. Don't forget to tell us in the comments which city you're listening from. Picture this. It's 821 AD, and you're living in Athcliath, what we now call Dublin. You're not just anyone, you're nobility, maybe the daughter of a chieftain, living your life in relative luxury. Then one morning, you wake up to the sound of screaming. Viking longships have appeared on the horizon like death itself, and your entire world is about to be turned upside down. The Annals of Ulster, one of our most reliable historical sources, recorded what happened next with chilling simplicity. Athcliath was plundered by the heathens and they carried off a great number of women. A great number of women. Just like that, entire bloodlines vanished from history. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing. This wasn't some random act of violence. This was business. Cold, calculated, strategic business. These Vikings weren't just grabbing women on a whim. They were conducting what was essentially a corporate raid on human resources. Athcliath wasn't chosen randomly either. This settlement guarded the northern approach to Dublin Bay, making it a strategic gold mine. The Vikings knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew exactly what they were taking. The moment those women were captured, something horrifying happened. Under Norse law, they were instantly reclassified as thrills, the absolute lowest rank in Viking society, not people, property. Imagine being a princess one day and cargo the next. These weren't just legal technicalities either. This reclassification meant everything about your previous life, your identity, your humanity, was completely erased in the eyes of your captors. Then came the journey that would make or break you. Literally. Picture being loaded onto a Viking longship like livestock, packed together with dozens of other terrified women, and then facing the brutal North Atlantic crossing. This wasn't just transportation, it was a survival filter. The weak died on the journey, and only the strongest made it to the slave markets. And where were those markets? Dublin had become one of the largest slave trading centers in all of Western Europe. The irony is devastating. You were being sold in what had once been your homeland. The economics of this human trade will absolutely shock you. A healthy young noblewoman was worth between 12 to 20 ounces of silver. To put that in perspective, that was equivalent to a small farmstead's entire annual output. These weren't desperate people selling whatever they could find. This was a sophisticated, highly profitable international business. From Dublin, these women could be shipped to Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, or even further along Russian river routes to the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate. If you had special skills like weaving or medicine, your price tag went even higher. But here's the most heartbreaking part. We don't know any of their names. Not one. The historical records deliberately erased their identities, turning human beings into economic statistics. They were absorbed into the Viking economic engine, and their stories vanished forever, or so we thought. Enter Melkorka Myrkjartansdottir, and her story will absolutely blow your mind. Mid-10th century, she was the daughter of Irish King Myrkjartan, living the royal life until Viking raiders changed everything. Around 956 AD, she found herself standing in a Norwegian slave market, being examined like merchandise by a wealthy Icelandic chieftain named Höskuldur Dala Kolsson. The Russian trader selling her, a man named Gilly, claimed he didn't even know her name. He was probably lying, but that lie was about to become Melkorka's secret weapon. Höskuldur paid 3 marks of silver for her. That's 24 ounces, 3 times the price of a prime milk cow. But here's where Melkorka's story becomes absolutely incredible. She refused to speak, not just on the journey to Iceland, not just for the first few weeks, but for years. Everyone assumed she was mute. They had no idea she was playing the longest game of survival psychology in medieval history. In Höskulder's hall, she lived as his frilla, basically a concubine, and bore him a son named Olafur. But she never broke her silence, never revealed who she really was. This wasn't just stubbornness. This was strategic brilliance. Her silence was her armor against complete powerlessness. If they didn't know she was royal, they couldn't use her royal connections against her. But then came the moment that changed everything. Höskulder was walking by a stream when he overheard something that stopped him cold. Melkorka was teaching her young son Gaelic, telling him stories about his grandfather, Mirkjartan, king of the Irish. The secret was out, and suddenly everything shifted. Her status improved, though she was never freed. She remained a captive princess for the rest of her life, watching her son Olafur grow up to become Olafur the Peacock, who would eventually travel to Ireland, meet his grandfather, and be acknowledged as Irish royalty. Melkorka died in Iceland, never seeing her homeland again, but her silence had protected her son's future. Now, if you think that story is intense, wait until you hear what happened at Coldingham in 870 AD. The great heathen army had been terrorizing England for 5 years, and now the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, including the legendary Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan, were turning their attention north to Scotland. Their target? Coldingham Monastery, one of those double monasteries that housed both monks and nuns. The abbess, Ebba the Younger, knew exactly what was coming. Viking raids on religious houses had become notorious for systematic sexual violence against religious women. In the Viking worldview, violating holy women wasn't just about physical assault, it was about spiritual conquest, destroying the very foundations of Christian society. For the religious women themselves, rape was considered a fate that would taint their souls worse than death itself. What Ebba did next will give you chills. As the Viking army approached, she gathered all her nuns in the chapter house and did something so extreme, so desperate, that it's almost impossible to comprehend. She took a razor and sliced off her own nose and upper lip, deliberately disfiguring herself. Then she commanded her sisters, "Make yourselves a spectacle of horror to the lust of the barbarians." Every single nun followed her example. Can you imagine that scene? These women chose to mutilate themselves rather than face what they knew was coming. When the Vikings finally broke into the monastery, instead of finding victims, they found a silent assembly of disfigured women who had cheated them of their expected prize. The Vikings' response was swift and brutal. Enraged at being denied what they considered their right of conquest, they barred all the doors, piled timber around the building, and set the entire monastery ablaze. Every woman died in the flames, but they had made their choice. This wasn't a choice between life and death. It was a choice between two different kinds of death. But here's where the Viking strategy gets even more calculated and terrifying. Let me tell you about Canterbury, 1011 AD. Thorkel the Tall had been ravaging southern England for 3 years, and King Ethelred's policy of paying Danegeld, basically protection money, had only encouraged more attacks. After a brutal 20-day siege, Canterbury fell, but not before the treacherous Elfmere saved Archbishop Elfhea in exchange for his own life. The Vikings systematically sacked the cathedral and killed most of the population. But here's the crucial detail. They didn't kill the noble women. Why? Because these women were worth more alive than dead. They had become bargaining chips in brutal political negotiations, while Archbishop Elfhea was famously martyred, refusing to allow ransom to be paid for him and getting killed with an axe blow at a Greenwich feast in April 1012. The fate of the noble women was quieter, but no less terrifying. They became part of the peace price. The following year, a massive ransom of 48,000 pounds of silver was paid for the army's departure, and the freedom of these high-status women was calculated as a line item in this national transaction. Think about that. Queens and princesses reduced to accounting entries in international extortion. The scale of some of these operations will absolutely blow your mind. In 870 AD, while Halfdan and Ivar were burning monasteries in the east, another Viking force was attacking Strathclyde in the west. The leaders were Olafur the White, the Norse king of Dublin, and his ally Ivar, and their target was Altclut, Dumbarton Rock, the seemingly impregnable volcanic plug that served as the capital of Strathclyde. This wasn't just a raid. It was a siege operation that lasted 4 months. The Vikings couldn't scale the rock, so they did something even more brutal. They cut off the water supply. After 120 days, the well ran dry, and the defenders had to surrender or die of thirst. What happened next was one of the largest slave-taking events in the entire British Viking Age. The Vikings spent the entire winter on the Clyde, methodically collecting their plunder. When they finally sailed back to Dublin in 871 AD, they had 200 ships loaded with treasure and human cargo. The annals of Ulster recorded their haul with chilling precision. Great booty in people, Angles, Britons, and Picts. King Artgal himself was among the captives and was later killed in Dublin. The queen and all the court women who had once ruled from that impregnable rock were now slaves, their royal blood meaningless to their captors. But this wasn't just about random violence. This was organized, systematic resource extraction, where slaving wasn't a byproduct of warfare, it was the main objective. And if you think the story ends with raids, you're wrong. The settlement of Iceland reveals something even more disturbing about how Viking society was built on the backs of stolen women. The Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, documents the colonization of Iceland and tells us who the settlers were. The traditional story portrays these as brave explorers seeking freedom in a new land, but the reality is that Iceland was built with stolen women. Take Ingimundr, a Norwegian chieftain whose men raided Ireland and returned with captives who became forced wives. Or the Irish noblewoman Rafarta, who was taken by Vikingur Sorkvarsson and dragged to Iceland to become his wife whether she wanted to or not. Even among supposedly Christian settlers like Ketil the Foolish, who settled at Kirkjubear, their descendants married into families whose matriarchs were captured Irish women. But here's the smoking gun that proves this wasn't just a few isolated cases. Modern DNA studies have revealed something absolutely staggering about Iceland's founding population. While the male settlers had Norse paternal ancestry, up to 63% of the original female settlers had Irish or Scottish maternal ancestry. Do the math. For virtually every Norse chieftain who established a farm in Iceland, women were taken by force from their homelands in Ireland and Scotland. The foundation of this new nation was laid in systematic violence and forced marriage. These weren't willing participants in some romantic adventure. They were unwilling captives who became forced wives and mothers, forming the genetic and social basis of what would become modern Iceland. Now I want to tell you about perhaps the most haunting case of all, discovered not in dusty chronicles, but in the ground itself. In 1904, archaeologists excavating a burial mound near the Oslo Fjord uncovered what would become known as the Oseberg ship burial, one of the most spectacular Viking Age discoveries ever made. The ship itself was incredible, 21 meters of carved oak with a serpent-decorated prow, preserved in blue clay for over 1,000 years. Dendrochronology dated the burial to the summer of 834 AD. Inside were treasures that belonged in a fairy tale. Decorated carts, sledges, beds, chests, tapestries, 15 horses, and 4 dogs. It was clearly the burial of someone incredibly important. But it wasn't just one person. There were 2 women in that ship. The older one, aged 70 to 80 and suffering from cancer, was likely a queen or high priestess. The younger woman, around 50, was assumed to be her servant or companion. For decades, that's where the story ended. Then modern science got involved, and what they discovered will give you chills. DNA analysis of the younger woman revealed she carried mitochondrial DNA of haplogroup U7, extremely rare in Scandinavia, but most common around the Black Sea and Iran. Dietary analysis of her bones showed a sudden shift to a high-protein Norwegian elite diet late in her life. The evidence points to something heartbreaking. She was likely a noblewoman from the East, captured in a raid, and forced into a life of privileged slavery. She lived better than a field thrall, certainly, but she was still property. And when her mistress died, her life became forfeit. She was killed to serve in the afterlife, and then buried with all the splendor that reflected not her own status, but that of the woman who owned her. Even the lavish burial was an act of possession. She belonged to her mistress in death, as completely as she had in life. Here's what makes all of this even more chilling. In 2009, archaeologists discovered a mass grave at Ridgeway Hill containing 54 young Scandinavian men who had been executed around 1000 AD. Their bodies were thrown in a pit, 51 skulls piled separately. Isotope analysis proved they were from Scandinavia, including one from north of the Arctic Circle. This discovery was so unusual because finding Viking men being killed and disposed of was incredibly rare in the written records. But you know what filled those same chronicles from the Annals of Ulster to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle? Stories of captured local women. For every Viking crew that met a violent end, dozens more returned home with human plunder. The women were the true spoils of war, their fates unrecorded, their names lost, their value measured in silver, while their human worth was deemed irrelevant. The scale of this systematic capture and enslavement of women was one of the invisible foundations of Viking economic expansion, and it's a story that's been largely erased from popular history. These weren't isolated incidents or unfortunate byproducts of warfare. They were calculated strategies that funded Viking civilization and built new societies on the forced labor and reproductive capacity of stolen women. From the markets of Dublin to the farms of Iceland, from the burial chambers of Norway to the monasteries of Scotland, the untold story of these women reveals a much darker truth about the Viking Age than any movie or TV show will ever admit. Their silence in the historical record isn't because their stories didn't matter. It's because those who profited from their suffering made sure their voices would never be heard. That's the real story behind the Viking conquests. Not just the taking of treasure and land, but the systematic theft of human lives, dignity, and freedom on a scale that held. Reshape medieval Europe. The next time you see a Viking epic celebrating warrior culture, remember the queens, princesses, and daughters of chieftains whose unrecorded suffering built that world. Their names may be lost to history, but their story, finally, can still be told.
Drink to victory.